Thank you, everybody. Thanks again for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here and for having me today. I've been traveling around the country talking about the issue of school vouchers, and I know how important the work all of you do in your communities are to just basic liberties, and I'm honored to be here and to talk about this big one here today. If you indulge me, I just want to take a minute to add a small piece to my biography because it highlights the door that I use to enter this kind of work. It's an important part of the book that I wrote, and it's part of the message that I'm going to try to get across today, at least in the sort of central piece of my talk. I'm not going to go line by line, but the take-home point here is that I started my professional life as a policy analyst, first as a young researcher at Georgetown, and then eventually through making my way up in the field with bigger and bigger projects. I worked with state agencies, school districts, and other partners to help learn what policies and programs work for kids and families, which don't work, for whom both of those questions are applied, and why. And I started all of that work studying school choice. So these are programs collectively that fund children who go to school outside their residential districts, especially, in my case, studying school vouchers. Now, there are a lot of different ways to deliver school vouchers if that's your policy goal. And we can talk about some of those in the Q&A. I hope to leave a lot of time for that. But for the purposes of today's talk, I just want to kind of define two things. So vouchers are going to be anything that uses public funding for private school tuition, and importantly, anything that also requires a child to exit or to never be enrolled in public school to begin with. So there's a whole class of social service programs, many of which I support, probably many of you support, that might use a type of voucher-like scheme to fund some other priority, child care, preschool, something like this. But you don't have to disenroll from public schools to do it. So for today's talk, we're going to say a voucher is something that funds private school, K-12 tuition, and something that requires the student to not be enrolled in public schools to get those dollars. A key part of my message today is that from a policy standpoint, we know three basic things about vouchers. Vouchers defund public schools, they devastate student learning, and discriminate against vulnerable kids and families. But there's more. And it's actually that more that I want to talk to you mostly about today, where vouchers came from and what's really going on. First, just a status check. Now, this chart's actually a few months old now. It's built by researchers at a policy think tank at Georgetown. It's a few months old, and it's broken down by type of voucher scheme. But even if you're in the back and you can't read the small print, I think you can get the idea from the basic shape. So on the far left is Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the first modern voucher system was created. And on the far right are today, so it's 2023. We're most of the way through the next year, but it's an upward slope, so vouchers are on the march. And then over the last 24 months or so, 24 states have passed some form or expanded some form of vouchers, and now we have 13 states that have universal vouchers, which means no income cap at all. Anyone can get those dollars. So with that basic introduction, let's talk about what's driving vouchers today. In the book, in the privateers, I talk about the origin of these schemes in the resistance to integration, to racial integration, ordered by Brown v. Board in 1954. The conservative economist Milton Friedman first proposed the voucher idea in 1955, just months after Brown v. Board. And I and really others have actually sort of fleshed out the history of vouchers located in massive resistance to Brown. But if we're talking about vouchers today, we have to talk about Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is the billionaire heiress from my own state in West Michigan. As an aside, Catherine Stewart, who I think is coming up after me, is in the audience. I quote Catherine's book in my own book. It's a really great description of the way the DeVos family has impacted American politics. She says that sort of to a very large extent, much of today's conservative, religious-based political push in this country over the last few decades has its financial origins in a billionaire family in West Michigan, and that's the DeVos folks, and that includes on the topic I'm talking to you about today. Betsy DeVos has lamented the role of public schools in American life. She thinks public schools have replaced churches as centers of community, and she wants to use school choice vouchers. They call it school choice. She wants to use school choice to, in her words, advance God's kingdom on earth. She has the money to do it. This spring, CNN got a hold of an internal slide deck showing that DeVos and her allies have spent more than $250 million over the last decade to pry out $25 billion, with a B, dollars in voucher funding across all the states. That's a $100 payoff for private school vouchers for every dollar DeVos and folks have put in. Now, as a social scientist, I do think it's important to ask who, if anyone, these voucher schemes are benefiting. What if vouchers really are just an opportunity for kids who've been ill-served for whatever reason by their public schools? But that's not actually what vouchers do. For one thing, most voucher users, around 70%, were already in private school to begin with. And the Voucher Lobby knows this, even though they don't admit it. They market these things as new opportunities for kids, especially to leave struggling public schools. They don't want to admit it, and they do want to pull more and more children out of public schools. Remember, I said to get a voucher in these modern schemes, you have to be disenrolled from a public school. So there's a variety of ways they have to kind of do this. One new way, just a few weeks ago, ProPublica reported, you'll see in Ohio, the state's actually funding new private school construction. Keep in mind, 90% of private schools in this country are religious in some way. So the state of Ohio is actually using grant funding to just send to private schools to build new seats. And that's, as ProPublica says, unprecedented so far. All right, so that's the first thing. So vouchers mostly fund, at least in the early years that a scheme comes to town, vouchers mostly fund kids already in private school. So what happens to the kids who do transfer from public to private school? That would be historically about 30% of voucher users. And the answer is they suffer horrific academic consequences, especially in math and science, in the STEM subjects. Over the last decade, vouchers have caused some of the worst academic declines on record in the education research community. You have to go to something like what Hurricane Katrina did to the academic outcomes of kids in Louisiana, or more recently to pandemic-sized learning loss today, to get at the magnitude of what we're talking about here. And there's a basic reason why. So most private schools are not the elite academies you may have heard of or that some of you may have even attended. They're what I call subprime providers, often financially distressed, most of them attached to churches, which, by the way, siphon off much of the revenue from those schools. Many of them teach things like creationism, flat earth curriculum in Arizona, there's been some new reporting, instead of academic basics. So what's really going on? I call vouchers a new religious separatism in American education. Funding discrimination in the name of that private school's creed or values. Both of those terms are in, either of those two terms are in the authorizing language in the legislation for all the new voucher schemes that I mentioned a second ago. So they're funding discrimination in the name of these private schools' creed or values against It's often the most vulnerable kids out there. So it's no accident that we're talking about vouchers, that I'm here today to talk about this kind of very specific policy item. In the same moment as book bans, the teaching of accurate histories about the role of race in American history, and new attacks on LGBTQ plus rights. It's also a cult of personality around Donald J. Trump. This particular report or study by the Heritage Foundation, the authors of Project 2025, are starting to lean very heavily into culture war explanations for the need for vouchers. The central point of my book is that after a decade of the most horrific academic declines on record, Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos, that era of 2016 to 2020, which was exactly the time that all these horrific results for vouchers started coming out, that administration, the Trump years, saved the voucher movement as it allowed DeVos, a series of right-wing political groups, to lean back into Christian nationalism to make the case for vouchers. Didn't have to sell it as an academic opportunity anymore like they used to when I first started as a young researcher. You still hear a little bit of that today, especially as a way to beat up on public schools, teachers, and especially teachers' unions. But increasingly, you see stuff like this. It's about wokeism. It's about what public schools are teaching, and we need to get rid of it in their view. Now, there's a right-wing group called the Lindy and Harry Bradley Foundation, which has funded most of the favorable voucher studies out there, most of the think tanks pushing those studies, like Heritage, Cato Institute, EdChoice, which is a big voucher lobby group, millions in dollars of voucher advocacy on top of that research, and nearly all of the litigation pushing vouchers forward in the states and in federal courts over the last 2 decades. But the thing you have to understand about all of this is all of these groups are doing a lot of other things. In the case of Bradley, they are pushing heavily other areas to undermine public schools, like the pandemic-era fights over in-person learning. Bradley was heavily funding election denial schemes in the last few years, insisting Trump won in 2020. Again, keeping in mind they're also funding these voucher schemes, the voucher advocacy, voucher research, and voucher litigation while they're doing this other stuff on election denial, and voter suppression efforts, insisting on IDs, throwing out supposed rigged and voter fraud, as they see it, voter fraud instances in the states. Bradley is also funding a new legal PAC it's called America First Legal, started by Donald Trump's anti-immigration crony, Stephen Miller. Bradley's also funding groups aligned with Turning Points USA, which is the network of far-right, young political operatives doing a lot of the ground game. If you read some of the reporting on what's going on in the campaigns, the Trump folks aren't doing a lot of what sort of the historic efforts to get out the vote, door-to-doors, lit drops, and things like that. They're giving these out to third parties, to super PACs that federal law allows them to do now, and the most important of those is Turning Points USA's super PAC. So all of this is part of this long-term, long-game effort, and vouchers are a key part of that story. Now, I'm an education analyst, but you don't have to be an education analyst to really understand why they're focusing on education specifically so much as part of this core part of other efforts going on in right-wing political organizing, in particular right-wing political organizing around the area of Christian nationalism. Because what is education actually about? Is it about academics? I mean, I showed what happens to children on test scores a few minutes ago when they give up their public school seat and they go to a voucher school. Most critics of vouchers and most defenders of public school would also say, test scores don't measure everything. Academics even aren't everything about a school. There's other things that we're trying to accomplish in building community. Academics are a core part of the mission usually in public schools, and I support that. But there's other things going on. So what's this really all about? It's quite literally, education is about the future, isn't it? Now, if you grew up in a faith tradition, as I did, and still practice as I do, you know how much emphasis is placed on child development. So I see vouchers, book bans, fights about school bathrooms, locker rooms, who plays which sports. This is all really about trying to mold not just our children, but everyone's child into what Christian nationalists think they ought to be. And doing so very specifically in the theory of action behind vouchers by separating out, isolating, and excluding those kids who are what, in the view of these Christian nationalists, are sinful, unclean, other, not a part of the vision they have for the United States. All right, so let's summarize just what I've had to say, and then I'm happy to take some questions. Vouchers have caused unprecedented academic harm. The Voucher Lobby, folks like Betsy DeVos, I haven't talked a lot about Charles Koch, he plays into this too in more of a secular, right-wing billionaire way. But the Voucher Lobby folks like DeVos, like Charles Koch, they know this. They know about this horrific academic harm. They had to answer for it when DeVos was secretary. So this is why they've turned increasingly back to Christian nationalism, something very near and dear to DeVos's heart and those of the other folks pushing this stuff. It's about Christian nationalism making this case. And so vouchers have to be understood as part of this larger political moment we're in. They headline Project 2025 and the Trump 47 education agenda. Universal school vouchers, for wealthy people, not just targeted for income, universal school vouchers are two of the first three paragraphs in the education chapter of Project 2025, right after our call for ending the U.S. Department of Education, which is the chief anti-discrimination authority in the United States for schools. In the foreword to Project 2025, Heritage's president, Kevin Roberts, calls for universal vouchers, puts forward a litmus test for conservative presidential candidates saying they have to support universal vouchers. Before launching into this big screed about gender ideology, what he calls the noxious tenets of gender ideology, critical race theory, and others that are poisoning our children, in his words. Okay, so vouchers are a religious separatist movement with designs on takeover and expansion, designs on public funding, which ultimately is our funding, that of everyone in this room and our families back home. The good news, I always try to end on something, a little bit of a positive note anyway. It's tough stuff. And I haven't talked a lot about this, but you know what, as the evidence from a social science standpoint has accumulated against vouchers over the last decade, so too has the evidence for the powerful impact, empirical impact at least, of directly investing in public schools and communities. We know that direct investments in public schools have improved academic outcomes, but also not just academics, later in life outcomes, like wages in communities, like reductions in contact with the criminal justice system. We know that certain initiatives, specifically that what we would call, in my world, whole child initiatives, like funding hungry kids, universal school meals, funding new improvements. It turns out that hungry kids don't learn as well, but hot kids don't learn as well in the summer, cold kids in the winter don't learn as well, improving the climates for these kids in their learning communities. Kids with asthma don't learn as well when they're having struggles to breathe. We just got out of a pandemic investing in the ventilation systems, the clean water in these communities. I live near Flint, Michigan. We know what happens when kind of disinvestment in communities happens. It affects children's lives across the board, not just in their schools. We know those investments do work. So we have some good news there, but the first step to making that case for that good news, it can't just be coming from the social science community, right? And it isn't. But the first step has to be making the case against the threats that are coming for those kinds of investments. Understanding those threats in the form of vouchers in today's topic, but understanding where they come from and what the ultimate goal is. So that's sort of what I've got in terms of prepared comments. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions if we have the capability to do that. I'm not sure how we want to do that. Okay, it looks like they've got some mics over there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I'm speaking as a school board trustee who has served a public education school district for 13 years. And I've seen the effects of school choice on public education. And I wanted you to speak to charter schools, which were actually the beginning of and led to the voucher system.
Yeah.
Charter schools like vouchers take away public tax dollars from public neighborhood schools. Consequences are that the students that are left behind in those public schools lose resources, class sizes grow, fewer teachers and administrators on the school site for school services. So the role of charter schools in your story, and then also why the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees equal right to equal education for every student in the United States, is not more used to explain why charter schools and private schools, religious schools included, who are discriminatory and who can attend their schools is unconstitutional.
Yes, so thank you for the question. So there is some debate in the public education community about the role of charter schools. It's not an area that I touch on too much in the book for the simple reason that up until very, very, very recently, charter schools have not been part of this religious push in the education space. Certainly the DeVos folks of the world have funded some charter school initiatives. There are some charters funded by Koch organizations. Charters still have substantial support in some of the progressive pockets, particularly in urban areas and particularly among Democratic representatives representing those urban areas. The evidence for charter schools is a lot more mixed too. You don't see those horrific results academically that you do for vouchers. And flip side, you see a handful of positive results for charters. But there's no doubt that they are part of kind of this neoliberal push to create sort of what they see as market incentives for public school improvement. And we do know that there's a new court case coming out of Oklahoma that colleagues of mine at the Education Law Center are a part of, that they're trying to get the first religious charter school online, and there's a case before the U.S. Supreme Court on that right now. So charters are an area that I'm watching very carefully. In my state and in Arizona, you've got massive amounts of for-profit operators running charter schools. But they haven't, up again until recently. So the Heritage Foundation, as just an example of what I'm talking about, recently released its yet another report, put all these things in quotation marks, just saying they're done with the charter school movement. Charter schools have themselves become too woke. We all know what that means. And that really, if you're going to get real school choice, what they mean is school choice for religious families and school choice, public funding for religious families to separate out. You got to abandon charter schools too, in their view, and just go straight to vouchers for private school tuition. So there is a little bit of a push-pull right now going on that side of things.
Hi, I'm from Anchorage, Alaska, and I noticed on your chart, and I also noticed this in another discussion of school vouchers yesterday, that Alaska wasn't represented on the charter. So I didn't know if that's because Alaska just isn't on your radar and you're not aware of what's happening there, or if there's something qualitatively different about the voucher battle in Alaska as compared with the ones you were discussing?
I think if I'm being honest with you, it's probably the first, to be perfectly candid with you. Most of the efforts have been in a handful of states, and that's where a lot of the dollars have been spent in expanding these things, yeah.
Yeah, we have, there was a voucher program put in place. We have a right-wing governor.
Yeah.
It was in place for about a year. It was recently thrown out as unconstitutional under the state constitution, and our state government is now, they're now appealing that decision and trying to get it reinstated.
One reason that I sort of made the differentiation up at the front about sort of both private school tuition and then also leaving public schools to get those dollars, there are, and I don't know the specifics of the Alaska plan, but you do see some mechanically similar voucher systems in states that have very geographically isolated communities, and what, as well as traditionally Native communities, in some places out here in the American West, where the word for this is shared time. So public and private providers kind of partner in certain spaces, and they look a lot like vouchers, but they aren't kind of necessarily part of the this kind of far right focus in some of these states like we're dealing with in other spots. I don't know for sure at the Alaska case, but I do know that there are some mixed use type plans that we kind of have to think about, but they aren't kind of the political thrust
Right,
right
because
now.
the intent with the vouchers there is to get money to
Churches and church
schools.
Yeah.
We had an existing homeschooling program.
Yep.
And they glommed it onto that, and now the whole thing is a mess. They've ruined the homeschooling program, which is what you're referring to.
The homeschool piece is a new flavor as well in this.
Right.
There's been another, like with charters, there's a big divide in the homeschool community about whether they even want to deal with what comes with vouchers and things like that. So it's something they're certainly worried about, but hasn't kind of grown into the big piece of it yet.
My state is having a ballot referendum in November to repeal its voucher system.
Which
and I'm
state?
just wondering how much history there is nationwide with these referenda coming up to a state question and how they fare.
Which state?
Nebraska.
Yeah. So there are three. So Nebraska's one. Here in Colorado, there's an effort to clear the way for public funding for religious schools, Amendment 80 on the ballot. And then in Kentucky, Amendment 2, they're trying to also crack open the state constitution after an unfavorable ruling by their state Supreme Court last year, saying public money couldn't go to private religious schools. So there are three on the ballot in November. Turns out vouchers have never actually won a statewide ballot initiative, so pro or con. And this is why a lot of that money that I mentioned a minute ago that the DeVos folks and others are spending has been targeting rural Republican legislators. Rural Republican legislators in the South have kind of held the line against vouchers over the last couple of decades. They don't like them. There's been some not because they're the biggest defenders of public schools per se. They're perfectly happy these days to vote against, sort of anti-woke legislation, as they call it, and things. But public schools are the schools in those rural communities, and they don't have private schools there, and they want to defend their constituencies. But a lot of this DeVos money has been targeted toward primarying out those rural Republicans that have been opposed to vouchers in the past. And this is how Iowa just got passed. This is how Arkansas just got passed. This is if Texas passes a voucher scheme. This is how Texas will have passed it, and how Tennessee will pass an expanded version if they get that done in Tennessee. Point being, it would be cheaper and more straightforward to just go direct ballot and do it that way, but they don't have the votes because vouchers have yet to ever survive as direct statewide ballot initiative. So if I do have another silver lining, and apart from just directly investing in public schools, it is that when put to the test, voters hate these things, and they have to get them done through sort of middle of the night ramming through recalcitrant state legislatures.
Hi, I'm from North Carolina, and as you've noted in the chart, we recently expanded the universal voucher system there. So beyond getting past, this separation of church and state as far as the dollars going to private schools, I'm curious how or what is the argument for them to get around the standards as well? Like they don't have to have certified teachers. They don't have to have, certified curriculum. They can basically do what they want. They're not even accountable to the state that's paying for their programs.
Well, so it's funny you mention that. These folks know the same. They know the same results I do. So in the older days, when I first started doing this work, vouchers were part of this larger push to kind of, quote, hold all schools accountable. They had been in the initial language for No Child Left Behind, but got thrown out during legislative debate. But this era of more accountability, more testing, more reporting results by school name, vouchers were caught up in that in roughly 2004 till about a decade ago. And then headlines like this one, I don't know if it's still on the screen, but then headlines like this one started coming out. So vouchers started just catastrophically failing on those report cards. And so now all of the legislation you see, whether it's in North Carolina or elsewhere, removes any meaningful reporting requirements from these voucher schemes. Because they know that these results, when Betsy DeVos was Secretary of Ed, she actually had to answer for headlines like this because she was a public official, couldn't just sort of tweet out a denial. A handful of states do have kind of minimal sort of opt-in type accountability requirements where they might say you have to take an exam, but it's not going to be reported out by the school name like public schools have to do. All of that is a recent, I guess you could call it an innovation. All of that is a recent response to headlines like this over the past decade. They don't want anyone looking under the hood anymore. And it's not just academics, it's also financial records and so on and so forth.
Hi, my name is Barbara. Do you see that they can ever put the genie back in the bottle on these vouchers when, people get so used to this money, can that ever be changed? You know, just like everything, Social Security, it's hard to change things, which of course we don't want it to. But do you see it could ever be changed back to the way it is?
Well, so the question was, could you put the genie back in the bottle? Illinois did sunset its voucher tax credit scheme. So the tax credits are a way to fund these things essentially by allowing donors, whether corporate or individuals, to divert what they would pay in state income taxes into a voucher paying fund that then just distributes the voucher to it. There has not yet been a sunsetting of a voucher that was put into a state budget. And that's why even in a place like Pennsylvania, which has already a huge voucher tax credit system that's completely unaccountable. It's actually not legal to collect data on the scheme. You just don't know anything about it. But you still see Betsy DeVos and Jeff Yass, another billionaire in this space, trying to push vouchers in Pennsylvania through the general fund, through the state budget. The reason for that is it is, to your point, it is a lot harder to get rid of any program for any interest group, however narrowly targeted it is, once it makes it into a budget, for the simple reason that then folks got to have a tough vote to kill it. In Arizona, Governor Hobbs, who's a voucher critic, has introduced a plan to try to curtail it with some really good common sense tools. So I have a report coming out next week that sort of tries to, the only good voucher bill is a non-existent voucher bill, but working in the world as it is to some extent before we get to the world as it should be, you do have to kind of figure out how do we keep kids and families, especially those, I call vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending for the kids lured out of public schools. How do we help them while still working toward that long goal of full elimination? And it starts with transparency, accountability, anti-discrimination, and so on. One thing I'll just say about Governor Hobbs' plan in Arizona, she tried to get something as basic as background checks and fingerprinting for private school teachers, taking public dollars, and it was a non-starter for the voucher folks in the state legislatures. They said it's just the hands of government. They want the check from government, but they don't want the accountability for it. If we're in a world where background checks for teachers around kids in private schools is a step too far for the voucher lobby, I'm not optimistic that we're going to have a lot of area for compromise there. So I think that's what time we have. So all right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Appreciate it, everybody.